So as we talk about global governance, it's important to think about and understand intergovernmental organizations, which are the international organizations that are comprised of, made up by, formed by states. And they end up being really central to this story about how states cooperate and work together. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of why these organizations are created by states, what they do, and then kind of thinking about like how important and where they play a role in international politics. And so if we're just sort of asking that basic question, like why do these things even exist? You know, states function for thousands of years, hundreds of years without formal institutions like intergovernmental organizations to bring them together. I'd say, well, we typically have two different explanations for why in the last 150 years, mechanisms to formalize cooperation among states have become more important. And so one of those stories is what we might call the functionalist explanation, where there's problems that states face that they can't easily handle alone. And as a result, they create an organization to basically deal with that problem, right? So an example of this might be there's a river like the Nile that flows between many countries, and they need to make sure that the water is flowing at an appropriate level, so that if countries are building dams at one point, that doesn't affect countries downstream, or if it does affect countries downstream, we understand the consequences and we can kind of work through that. But that's a very specific kind of problem that affects a very specific group of states, and maybe creating a formal international organization to deal with that kind of problem makes perfect sense, because they have a forum, they can interact, they can hash out their differences, they can respond to different problems like we have rainfall this year, we didn't have rainfall last year, how do we want to manage the water level, and who bears the cost if the water is too high or too low, right? And so there's a problem, and that need to solve that problem drives the creation of the organization. That's one story, and I think that helps explain why we have 5,000 plus international IGOs, intergovernmental organizations across the international system, because different groups of states have found that they have different problems to manage. There's another story, however, that I think is maybe worth building in, because the functionalist explanation doesn't explain a lot of what international governmental organizations actually do, but the neo-functionalist organization story actually does. The neo-functionalist story says, yeah, sure, an organization was created. Maybe it was created because there was a problem. Maybe it was created out of some sort of aspirational desire to do good in the international system. We don't really know or really care, but once the organization exists, there are going to be people who want to keep their job, who want promotions, who want bigger budgets, who want to demonstrate to states that they are useful and that they are providing value, and they should continue to keep their jobs in their offices and get promotions. And so the people within those organizations are going to find ways to make the organization useful to states. And so the United Nations system was initially created to stop a rehash of World War II, to make a collective security system that was imagined by the League of Nations work better. But once it was created, there was a secretariat, there was a core to that organization that began looking for different things it could do. And so you get organizations like UNESCO, which comes out of the UN system, that say, well, we could catalog all of the important World Heritage sites so that they're being preserved and maintained. And also, if there's a war, not to bomb that particular site because that's an archaeological dig, right? And states never thought before, ever once, that maybe they would want a list of where all the important historical and cultural sites are to not bomb during war. But once UNESCO began compiling the list, it ended up being really handy, and it did help states, and they saw value in it. And there's hundreds of examples like that where the United Nations system starts looking for problems and saying, here are things that we could do that would provide value, and they take on new roles. And so it's not so much that states knew what they were doing, it's that once they created capacity within these organizations, that capacity finds problems, it finds responsibility, and it expands out to where it can be useful. There's maybe a counter cranky explanation, however, for why these organizations exist, that's less focused on the problems and more focused on power politics. And so the realist explanation would be that international organizations exist because they serve the interests of powerful states. The powerful states like them, that they work for powerful states, and when they stop working for powerful states, they'll disappear. And so, during the 19th century, powerful states didn't organize around formal institutions. They organized around the concert system, and periodically they would send representatives to meet and discuss and negotiate. we've just replaced that with the UN Security Council, where powerful states, the victors of World War II, right, the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France, hold power and make decisions. And as long as that configuration makes sense in terms of who holds power in the international system, it'll continue to operate. But when powerful states decide that it no longer serves their interests, they'll walk away and do something else that more appropriately reflects what they're trying to do. So alternative perspectives, and I think you can actually find examples where each of these maybe tells an important story, and I'd encourage folks to kind of keep in mind that realist explanation when we talk about voting patterns in the International Monetary Fund, because I think that structure and that system actually fits the realist explanation fairly well. When we think about what intergovernmental organizations do, it's a lot more than just sort of solving problems like managing water flows or cataloging historical sites. But I'm thinking sort of broadly about how they facilitate cooperation. I would note that they provide a forum for interaction, that maintaining a global diplomatic infrastructure is really expensive. Most states can't and don't maintain a global diplomatic infrastructure. They have embassies in their neighbors' states, maybe. They send representatives, diplomats to a handful of powerful countries where they want to have a voice, they want to engage. Nepal, for example, doesn't actually have representation much outside of Nepal. It has an embassy with India in New Delhi, and if you want to communicate with Nepal, usually you go to the Indian government and say, we would like you to pass this message to Nepal. But every country has the resources to be able to send one representative to the United Nations to represent them in New York City. And that means that countries who previously would never have interacted are suddenly having their diplomats pass in the hallway. And so you have, diplomats from Costa Rica encountering diplomats from Ghana and saying, hey, wait a second, we're both coastal, small economies that are commodity dependent. We have the same complaints about how the global economy is working. This facilitates an opportunity for us to realize those common interests and advocate. So it creates a way for states to connect when they wouldn't otherwise connect. And that actually is really important, particularly when things are disintegrating and normal channels of communication are breaking down, particularly ahead of a military conflict. Oftentimes one of the first things that you do is you shut down your embassy, and so those channels to maintain communication disappear. But the New York channel, which is the representative to the UN of country A and the representative of country B, go out for coffee and at a Starbucks talk about how to get out of a diplomatic crisis. That channel, that New York channel, is going to remain open even as countries are hurtling toward military conflict. And so that's valuable, that remains open even in times of crisis. And even countries that don't have formal diplomatic ties, like the United States and North Korea, can still use that New York channel to communicate when they need to. International organizations facilitate cooperation, and this involves both, just the nuts and bolts logistics of getting meetings set up, setting up the tables, making sure there's coffee stations, having an agenda. All of that stuff comes through international organizations, and the United Nations oftentimes facilitates many international treaty negotiations, and that's helpful and that's useful. But they also provide mechanisms to coordinate oversight. We've talked a lot when we talked about the prisoner's dilemma about how states might fear cheating, they might fear betrayal. One of the ways out of that is to have monitoring, and we talked about that with arms control and how the International Atomic Energy Agency plays a really important role in making the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty functional, because states are providing reports to the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is reviewing them and then investigating them to make sure that states are actually in compliance. And if they're not in compliance, that's being communicated out to everybody. And so that oversight mechanism really allows for states to trust that their treaty commitments and that their efforts at cooperation are going to be reciprocated and met with cooperation by others, and that the entire collective effort will work. And it's really hard to overstate this. I think for political scientists, this is probably the most important thing that intergovernmental organizations do, is that they provide this information piece to help states be confident that cheating is going to be caught and can be responded to because of an oversight and monitoring function. We can maybe think about intergovernmental organizations functioning as sort of independent actors within the international system who are maybe doing things on their own. And I think certainly for the European Union, this probably fits. The European Union is represented at international organizations like the G20. It oftentimes speaks with something of a unified voice, or at least an independent voice in international diplomacy. Certainly in trade talks, the EU is the entity that is making decisions. That you can't negotiate a trade agreement with Germany. You can only negotiate through the EU. So in some instances, intergovernmental organizations are incredibly powerful, but intergovernmental organizations oftentimes have to be very sensitive to the power dynamics in which they operate. And so while the head of the administrative apparatus or the secretariat of an intergovernmental organization can advocate or give speeches, set an agenda, host conferences, and do a variety of different things, when those tip into active policy making, maybe trying to put diplomatic pressure on states or publicly shaming states, that can be dicey ground to walk on. And in the 1990s, UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali clashed with the United States and was pushed out of that role as Secretary General and replaced by Kofi Annan, somebody who was perhaps more adept at balancing the interests of the majority of states with the interests of powerful states in the Security Council, and really maintaining the sort of delicate balance amongst all of these competing actors within that make up the intergovernmental organization. So I'm personally skeptical that intergovernmental organizations are able to play a role in international politics in a very direct way that runs contrary to what states want. But that shouldn't suggest that intergovernmental organizations don't matter. They matter a lot, just not as much when it comes to what realists would call high politics, the stuff that states really, really care about, right? The security questions. That tends to be where you're going to get a deadlock at the Security Council, where the United States is vetoing things, or Russia or China are vetoing things. It's where states' interests tend to override their willingness to cooperate and work together. And the best you can say is that maybe in these situations, when there is something that looks like consensus amongst the powerful states, that international organizations facilitate sanctions or coordinated efforts to punish other states. But those are pretty rare situations because states lock in pretty tight around their security interests. But in low politics, things that aren't security, intergovernmental organizations can have a huge influence because states largely don't care how things are resolved. They don't have strong preferences, and yet the payoffs can be incredible. And so there are, international organizations, bodies that set the rules for how door handles should be designed to make them compatible, workable for folks with physical disabilities. That's incredible. In the United States, we've had that since, I think, 1992 with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but international organizations took that concept and made it an international standard, and it doesn't really matter whether the door handle is, curved hook or kind of an angled hook. That doesn't matter. All that matters is we have a standard, and that we can implement that standard in building practices, and then that makes life better for folks. And that ends up being the kind of contribution that international organizations make, right? They're things that states don't necessarily care about in the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts details. They're willing to maybe throw a few resources at because it doesn't cost a lot, but the consequences can be huge for quality of life for people. And so when we think about air traffic control or disease control or passport standardization, these are things that states are happy to have happening They don't threaten anybody's interests, and all that really is required is just a little bit of cooperation. And I want to stress that this is incredible for human well-being, that this potentially exists as a way to address problems. And the illustration I oftentimes use to highlight like how big of a deal this is guinea worm. Guinea worm is a parasite, lives in tropical parts of the world, and it primarily hosts in humans. It's been found here and there in cats and dogs, but almost exclusively it preys on humans, and it's a monstrous creature. You get infected by drinking water where the larvae are in the water, and the larvae hatch, they turn to worms, the worms burrow out of your body, and when they reach the skin, the surface, they release a toxin that makes it feel like your body's on fire. And so your natural reaction is to put your hand or your leg or your whatever in the water to try to stop the burning, and that's when the worm lays its eggs and the larvae get into the water and the cycle starts again. And the only way to extract these things is over a long period of time of like peeling them out with sticks. It's awful. It's a monstrous creature that has traumatized humanity for as long as there has been humanity. And in the 1980s, there were close to 1 million cases of guinea worm disease every year. And in the early 1990s, the Carter Foundation, Jimmy Carter, went to Africa and encountered guinea disease and guinea worm disease and decided that this is something that had to be stopped. And so over the course of 30 years, international organizations, whether it's the World Health Organization or non-governmental organizations, have worked together to try to reduce the incidence of guinea worm disease, and it has fallen dramatically, so that possibly this year, 2023, we're down to 0 confirmed cases of guinea worm anywhere in the world. And when we hit 0 and we stay at 0 for a year or two, it's gone and it will never come back. And this is not the first time that international organizations have facilitated this kind of a global effort that has tremendously improved human well-being. We saw this with the smallpox, where in the 60s and 70s, international organizations coordinated and worked first at mass vaccination campaigns, and then by sending out teams to hunt smallpox village by village, with teams that went around with pictures of smallpox saying, "Have you seen this?" And people saying, "Well, not in our village, but 2 villages over, yeah, they have that. It's scary." Because smallpox was scary. It would kill 25 to 30% of the people who were infected, and the survivors would be disfigured pretty horrifically. And yet, with this coordinated UN effort across the international system, humanity was able to hunt smallpox to extinction. It does not exist. It does not threaten humanity. And after this, the entire history of humanity dealing with the scourge, it's gone. And this is where international organizations really excel. Nobody cares or is threatened by smallpox going away. Lots of states would actually like that to happen, and the kind of cooperation that's needed to make that happen doesn't cost a lot, doesn't threaten anybody, and is very easy to facilitate, but until we had an international organization to do it, it wasn't getting done. And so that's really the promise of international organizations, IGOs, is in the low politics, where the benefits from cooperation are huge and the threat to states is minimal.